All right, hello everybody. Good afternoon on what feels like actually a spring day. It's a little warm, a little dreary, but rain's better than snow, which is what we had last week during our last Privacy at Michigan event. So speaking of last Privacy at Michigan events, today will be our last Privacy at Michigan speaker. So on behalf of ITS and the School of Information who've convened the Privacy at Michigan day/week/months of programming, thank you for attending. Thank you for those who've attended past events. A couple housekeeping things. One, the usual, silence your stuff. There'll be some Q&A. This is being live streamed, so hello people out there in live stream land. Other important thing to know, there's gonna be a book signing after this. So this book, right here, Privacy's Defender, by Cindy Cohn, will be available for purchase right outside the door. So if you brought your credit card, please, you have an opportunity to get your book and get it signed. Other things to know. We have one final Privacy at Michigan event tomorrow. It is our accumulation of a semester-long art competition. So our first attempt at this. So we're at a university where we try and experiment and look at new things. So we had a privacy-themed art competition unveil. We will be having an exhibition of the winners and an award ceremony tomorrow in Palmer Commons at noon, so also open to the public, also refreshments. And so with no further ado, I want to bring to the podium Alex Halderman, faculty member and professor in the College of Engineering, and someone who has worked closely with and availed themselves of the skills and advocacy of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and its executive director, Cindy Cohn. So Alex, please.
Thank you, Saul. Well, good evening and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Cindy Cohn. Cindy has been one of the most important figures in the effort to ensure that our constitutional values survive contact with digital technology. A graduate of the University of Michigan Law School and now the outgoing executive director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Cindy has spent decades at the center of major legal and public battles over encryption, privacy, surveillance, and free expression online. The first time I met Cindy was in 2005, literally on the steps of the Supreme Court, where we were both present to attend oral arguments in a case about copyright and the future of the internet. But I already was very familiar with Cindy at that moment because she had already served as my lawyer. A few months before, I had the great fortune to be represented by Cindy when as a first-year graduate student, I was threatened by a company whose CD anti-piracy technology I had exposed as essentially ineffective spyware. Having Cindy as my lawyer helped me face that intimidation, and just as she and EFF have helped countless white hat hackers act fearlessly in the service of the greater good over the years. So what makes Cindy's work especially compelling is that it's never been only about technology in the narrow sense. It's also been about power. Who has it? How is it exercised? And whether the systems we build will serve human freedom or just quietly erode it. In a world where digital systems increasingly mediate speech, association, knowledge, and even governance itself, those are not merely technical questions. They're constitutional questions, democratic questions, and deeply human questions. That's the perspective at the heart of Cindy's new book, Privacy's Defender, My 30-Year Fight Against Digital Surveillance. And I think that's also the perspective that she'll bring, albeit with her wonderful sense of humor, when she appears on The Daily Show on Monday. You should all tune in. So we're very fortunate to have Cindy Cohn here with us today. Thank you, Cindy.
Absolutely one of my favorite clients ever. Alex never brings you an uninteresting case, and I've got stories. But thank you all for coming here tonight. Thank you for the very kind introduction. I wanted to start by figuring out who's in the audience. So how many of you are like come out of the law students? Just a couple, not very many. I know there's a countervailing event tonight. How many people are technical people? How many? There we go, my people. How many people would call yourself hackers? I mean that in the old school sense of the name. It's a term that I'm trying to reclaim from the people who took it from us as the, hacking as in hacking away on a big tree with a small axe kind of way. And how many people consider themselves activists? Yay, all right. And how many are EFF members? Oh, we can do better. But thank you very much, those of you who are. I'm hoping that by the end of this talk, I will have given you just a little insight into the discipline you're not coming from and not do any damage to the discipline you do come from. I am here to talk about my book, Privacy's Defender, My 30-Year Fight Against Digital Surveillance. I want to read you a couple little segments in a minute, but I want to explain why I decided to write a book. I have a couple of reasons, but one of them was that I felt like the history of, especially the 1990s version of the internet, the time that it went from kind of the plaything of governments and academics and stuff to something that all the rest of us were beginning to use. I kept getting frustrated because the story of that time seemed to be the stories about guys who started companies, guys with names like Jobs and Gates and even EFF's founder, Kapor. And I lived through those times and was active in those times. And I felt like that was a very narrow aperture to look at what were extremely rich times. And I got a little frustrated about it. And I had a dear friend say, well, why don't you put your keyboard where your mouth is and write your version of the history. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. But the other thing I wanted to do is there are lots of people who write about privacy. It's a rich field with amazing journalists who write about it, academics who kind of parse it out and explain it to everybody. But I really wanted, I've actually lived the work of fighting for privacy and mainly through the courts, but outside the courts as well. And I thought it might be a nice contribution to thinking about privacy to kind of let you ride along with me as we fought some of these battles. And I also really wanted to tell kind of a true story about what it's like to fight for social change when you're up against powerful governmental forces. Sometimes, the TV or movie versions of those are a little too clean, a little too by the first act they're fighting and then they lose and then they start to win and then they win and then by the last 15 minutes, we're getting ready for the next battle because they've won. And that's not really how it goes. It doesn't mean it's not rewarding, but I felt like the space could use a more realistic story about what standing up to work for change looks like. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but we could use some change right now. We're in a time in which privacy is really under threat. In a lot of ways, there are attacks from all directions, and we're going to have to stand together and work for the long run to make some of these changes. It's not going to be neat and clean and over in a year or two, or even longer than that. We didn't get into this mess overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight. And so I hope that by telling the story, I can show both that it's a long fight, but also that it's worth it and rewarding, and some really interesting things that can happen in your personal life if you dedicate yourself to making things better. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of them because some of them started here in Ann Arbor. So I tell 3 sets of stories in the books. Oh, I was supposed to do this, right? The B? Okay. I tell 3 sets, forgot. I tell 3 sets of stories in the book about 3 sets of cases that I've worked on. The first one is the fight that we took on in the 1990s to free up encryption technology from government regulations. Encryption is the way that we have privacy and security online. And while we don't have a private or secure internet now, we are in much better shape because we took on and won that fight than we would have been if we lost it. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The second set of cases are about our sets of fights to try to stop the NSA's mass spying, the mass telephone records collection, the mass collection of internet metadata, and the upstream collection of our communications as they flow through key internet stations. That was a multi-year, 17-year battle altogether, and it featured a couple of whistleblowers. One that you might not have heard of, his name is Mark Klein, and he's a former AT&T technician who literally brought us the schematics of how the NSA spying worked by knocking on our front door in San Francisco and handing it to us. And another one who I suspect you've heard of, his name is Edward Snowden, who 7 years later, 6, 8, in 2013, brought us incontrovertible proof that what Mark Klein had brought us was really actually happening, and really ended the period in which the government was lying about what it was doing. So I tell those stories in the book. And then the third ones are about something called national security letters. These are a kind of national security subpoena, meaning that the FBI can issue it on their own without having to go to a judge and make any kind of showing. And they come almost always with an eternal gag order, meaning that they go to your service provider, they ask for information about you, and they can never, ever tell you or anyone else that the whole thing happened. We fought those eternal gag orders on the grounds of the First Amendment, and chipped away at that as well. So I tell these three stories because they're kind of three centerpieces of the fight that I have helped lead to try to regain some privacy in the digital age. And let me start, and Alex mentioned this in his introduction, with how I think about privacy, or the part of privacy that's important to me and has kept me in this fight for so long. Sometimes people think of privacy and they think of, like, the Harry Potter cloak of invisibility that you put over your head when you're about to do something, untoward. Privacy can do that, that's true, but that's not actually why I've dedicated my life to defending it. To me, privacy is a check on power. It's a way that people who have less power can get some balance and protection against people who have more power. And you can see this in the small and in the large. In the small, my colleague Eva Galperin works with domestic violence victims. These are people who are facing abusers who have put spyware on their phones to surveil everything they do in order to maintain power over them and make sure they can't get away. They need privacy in order, literally, to plan to leave a very violent situation in their own homes. They need privacy against people who are more powerful than them, but who live in the same place with them most of the time. And then you can go up further. Right now, we're increasingly in a situation in which the spying on us that companies are doing is being used to do something called price discrimination. This is where the price you pay for something is based on all the things the company knows about you, from all the other sources of information about it. And what that means is they're trying to figure out how they can charge you the maximum price that you would pay for a service, regardless of what that service might be worth, kind of on any other measure. And people are starting to see this in rental housing. We're starting to see it in a lot of other places. This is a situation where the fact that they have more power than you, they have more information about you, means that they can manipulate literally how much money you pull out of your bank account in order to pay for the same thing that your neighbor might pay more or less for. We're starting to see this as well in home insurance prices. There was a big story in the New York Times about people's credit scores making the difference between how much they paid in home insurance. And your credit score doesn't have anything to do with whether you're going to make a home insurance claim because your kid set your house on fire, right? Not that ever happened to me or that I did it to my parents. But those kinds of things don't have anything to do with the credit score, but yet the amount people are paying. And we're going to continue to see that the data, other data that the companies are sucking in about us that's so freely available is going to be used to, the power disparity between us and the people we buy things from is going to get more disparate because they know more about us and we don't have the privacy to protect ourselves. And then the place where I've spent most of my career is about us vis-a-vis our government. That every social movement that has made change in my lifetime had a private part of it before it became public. Right? Somebody had to turn to someone and say, I don't think this slavery thing is a good idea. That was not a public conversation you could have until very late in the abolition movement. The same is true about gay rights. I mean, hopefully we'll get to keep. But in my lifetime, that went from something that you had to keep quiet in order to talk about to something where we got the U.S. Supreme Court to accept that gay marriage could be a thing and that many of our anti-discrimination laws apply to them. That fight is not over, but the trajectory is the same. That doing something that your government doesn't support requires a private conversation before it can be a public movement. And we see this in ways that are kind of, you may not see them until you point them out, but this is why we have a secret ballot in America, right? So that the people more powerful than you can't force you to vote for who they want, that you have a zone of privacy about who you choose in the ballot box. That's really important because most of us have somebody who has more power than us. And the secret ballot is really important. We've seen it in labor contexts where in order to keep your job, you have to vote for the person that your boss thinks you should vote for. That doesn't happen or can't be confirmed because we have a secret ballot. It's also deep in the idea of anonymous speech, the idea that an association. There's a famous case out of the civil rights era where the state of Alabama demanded the names of all the members of the NAACP. And the Supreme Court held, rightfully so, that people needed privacy in deciding which social movements they wanted to join when those social movements were controversial. And so the right of associational privacy meant that the NAACP didn't have to tell the state of Alabama, which is incredibly hostile to civil rights, who was giving them money, which would have identified them. So I think of privacy as fundamentally about how we maintain a self-governing society, how we maintain a society where people with less power have a chance to organize and regain power. And that flows through all of the work that we've done. So let me switch gears a little now and just read you a little of the book so you can hear a little of the stories. And I want to start at the very beginning of the book, the crypto, at the beginning of the crypto wars. Where is it? Cypherpunk Dress-Up Day. As I rounded the corner from the elevator on the 19th floor of the Federal Building in San Francisco, I could see that the crew that gathered on the in front of Judge Marilyn Hall Patel's courtroom was definitely not your normal courthouse fare. Standing and even sitting on the majestic marble floors were well over 30 people, mostly pale white men in their 30s with longish, stringy hair. They were uniformly scruffy and awkwardly dressed in suits and ties. They all seemed to be in outfits that their mothers picked out for them for a family wedding. Or maybe I was just projecting. I was 32 years old, worried about my hair, and wore a suit that my mother picked out for me from the Denver department store where she worked. They may have been a motley crew, but they warmed my heart. They were there to show support for me as I argued a case called Bernstein versus Department of Justice. It may not have looked like it, but it was obvious to me and that crew gathered on a cool San Francisco morning in September 1996 that what happened in the courtroom would be crucial to the future of the internet. How Judge Patel ruled would play a major role in determining whether people would have privacy online. So that's how it started. Now let me tell you how it ended. The meeting was in one of those majestic DC buildings. I could smell the wood polish on the wainscoting. I always tense up when I'm stepping into the halls of power, and this one felt especially powerful. Portraits of generals and other senior military officials, mostly men, looked judgingly down on me from the walls on either side of the room. As always, the chairs were too big for me, just like the ones in the courthouse in San Francisco where this all began. While the setup was intimidating, the underlying truth was quite different. We'd come to negotiate the terms of the government's surrender. Part of me was elated at our victory. Another part of me was disbelieving, but it was true, likely due to some combination of the court rulings, the mounting congressional action, and Silicon Valley corporate pressure. The government had decided to give in. Once we had settled in and pulled out our notes and files, Tony was my opposing counsel in this case. His name is Tony Coppolino. Tony, still in the shadows, started the meeting. He took a breath, and we braced ourselves. But he didn't sound angry. "I want to thank you for flying in from California to meet with us," he said to me, his voice bemused and perhaps a little resigned. "I guess for our purposes today, I am the Prince of Darkness." I felt a smile kick at the corner of my mouth, and without really thinking, I quipped, "I guess that makes me the Princess of Light." Then we began. Tony had sent me a proposed set of revised export regulations for review. They dropped the onerous and uncertain requirement of pre-publication review for open source and other publicly available encryption software. That had been the basis for our procedural prior restraint claims. The new regulations replaced that process with a simple requirement that someone exporting, that is, publishing, such encryption software merely send a link to or copy of the code to the government at the time of publication. It was 95% of what we wanted. We had a few suggestions and objections. The meeting lasted for about an hour. In the end, we didn't get much of our additional wish list, but we really didn't need to. The draft regulations were going to allow Dan Bernstein to publish his code, plus much, much more. The government was relinquishing nearly all of its grip on strong encryption and the science of cryptography. The benefits would reach Dan and the other academics, of course, but would also reach deep into the public side of the internet, allowing companies and individuals to implement strong encryption into the tools and systems that the rest of us rely on. We had ensured that the tools that protect privacy and security online were legal and that the science they came from could continue. So that's the fun part, and it was great fun. The other two stories, the NSA spying and the national security letters, didn't have as clear victory or narrative arc as the crypto story did. By the way, we had one in the district court, and there's not a lot of lawyers here, but we had one in the district court and the Ninth Circuit before they caved. But another thing that happened was Al Gore wanted to be president, and you may remember, if you're that old, that he was a kind of person who knew a lot about technology and cared a lot about the internet. I don't think he created it, but there was a story there. But anyway, all of these forces came together, and I think it's also an important lesson. Like, from my perspective as the lawyer, we had this wonderful, clean fight, but there were a lot of other things going on. There were people wearing T-shirts that had "This shirt is a munition" written on it with computer code on it. I think one guy actually got a tattoo with encryption code on it to demonstrate how regulating code violated the First Amendment if it wasn't done carefully. So there was a lot going on in that moment. After September 11th, the NSA's spying and the national security cases really were not that clear an arc. We won those more by chipping away, but over time, we dramatically shifted how the government did the mass spying. We ended two of the three programs we sued over. We scaled back the third pretty dramatically, and the public knows a lot more about what they're doing, and the government has a lot more oversight. We are not done, and believe me, I am mad as hell that we did not win those two cases outright, those two sets of cases outright, the way we should have. But when you look back, you realize that chipping away matters, and over a while, you've actually taken quite a bit out of the edifice of where where you started. So that's kind of the theme of the second two stories, but you have to read them yourself. I wanted to read one more little section to you, and that's because it happened here in Ann Arbor. So one of the things I tried to do in this book was to talk about my personal life and how my personal life was intertwined with the work that I have done and privacy. And the starting point of one of those stories is here in Ann Arbor. The chapter is called "You're Going Back to Where You Started." "Isn't it funny, Cindy? You're going back to where you started out." My father smiled at me in the rearview mirror as I sat in the back seat of the minivan. We were driving from Iowa to Michigan to drop me off for my first year of law school in Ann Arbor, stopping at Purdue University to drop off my sister on the way. He said it like he was talking about the weather. "What?" I asked, unsure of what he meant. "You were conceived in Ann Arbor, remember?" His smile got bigger as I looked more confused. Then it slowly dawned on me. When I was a child, I was adopted. That drive my parents took to get baby me was to Detroit. And one of the few things we knew was that my birth mother had been a Michigan student at the time she got pregnant. I was curious, but I wasn't ready to take any steps forward on the story just yet. I worried it could destabilize my mother. It wasn't until my third year at law school at Michigan that I finally screwed up the courage to try to find my birth mother. I used a flimsy story to get the alumni office to give me her address. I pretended to be the daughter of a college friend of hers. I was sternly told that only current students at the University of Michigan could get alumni addresses, to which I happily provided proof in the form of my Michigan ID. Privacy? Apparently not. Now, I don't think you could pull that off now at the same way that I did. But this became very important because later, when I started doing internet law, there was a picture of me. By the way, my birth mother did not write me. She wrote me back, but she did not want to meet. A few years later, my picture was on the front page of the business section of the New York Times under a story called "The Law Where There Is No Land," which tells you how the New York Times thought about the early internet. And I got a phone call a couple weeks later from a woman who said, "I was your mother's best friend during college, and I'm still her good friend. Are you the Cindy Cohn that was born in November 1963 in Detroit, Michigan?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, I think I know your birth mother. I think I can try to connect you again." And I kind of freaked out. At first I thought, I'm suing the NSA. These guys are spies. Are they trying to pull some kind of black ops thing on me? But later I did let her try. And ultimately, while my birth mother, I tell the story in here, while my birth mother didn't want to meet with me, I did get connected ultimately with my birth grandfather and got to spend the last 10 years of his life with him. And it all started here in Ann Arbor. So since I was here, I could not resist telling you a part of that personal story because it still kind of throws me off a little bit. So crazy story. Anyway, I want to get to questions pretty quickly, but I really, my goal, third goal in wanting to write this book is that I'm trying to recruit you. I think that standing up for privacy, or honestly anything else that you really care about and spending your life working towards a good cause, is a really fulfilling way to spend your life. Of course, I would love it if you all came and did privacy at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, but that might not be what calls for you. It might not be legal skills. It might not be technical skills. It might be some combination of those. But honestly, we need everybody. We need people who care about user interface, for God's sakes, to make secure tools that are easy for people to use. I really thank I was going to say the Lord, but really I have to thank Moxie Marlinspike that we have Signal right now that is easy for people to use. But for the first 10 years after you won the Bernstein case, we did not have encryption tools that were easy to use, and we need more of them. So if that's where you can put your skills, boy, do we need you. We need economists. We need analysts. We need people who can speak in public. We need people who can write in public, because privacy needs a posse. And so do not think that if you don't come out of tech or you're not a deep tech, you can't be part of this fight. I'm here to tell you that you can and that we need you. I am not, as you'll learn if you read the book, I was an English major. I am not a technical person. I am a person who is curious and really love to have technical people explain things to me so that I can translate them to people who wear black robes every day. But you don't have to be a technical person to be important in the world of protecting digital rights. So what are the things you can do? As I said, I'm trying to recruit you. I think there's a bunch of lessons in the stories. The first one is show up. I mean, those crazy hackers came to every hearing in the case, and I think that they helped the court understand there was more at stake than was in the briefs, and that this was important in terms of the future of the internet. And they showed up in a way that was respectful. They tried to speak the court's language by wearing the clothes and being quiet and respectful, but they showed up. And I think that's really important. And that doesn't have to be in court. It can be in the halls of Congress. It could be at your local board of supervisors if they're thinking about license plate readers or you're trying to get rid of them, which is something a lot of people are doing locally right now. Or it could be at your HOA. Or otherwise in your community to try to make sure that somebody is making a voice for privacy in here. You can use these tools. Privacy is a team sport. It's not something you do by yourself. I tell the story. I have a bunch of community, a bunch of girlfriends, and we have a chat, right, an ongoing chat going on. I was able to get them to move over to Signal, and I didn't do it because of privacy. I have to say I was a little stealthier than that. It was because a couple people had Android machines and a couple others had Apple machines, and the Android people kept getting kicked off. And so my pitch to them was, let's move over to Signal and we won't keep having to add row back into the chat. And it worked. And now they're all on Signal. So I think they all get the privacy piece now since they're all reading my book. But until then, you can be stealthy and still give people privacy. But use the tools. Educate, share, welcome people into the community. I think that the tech community sometimes isn't very welcoming to people who don't have tech skills. They sometimes make a litmus test or, how much do you know about this before you let them in. We do not have that luxury anymore, my friends. We have built a panopticon, and it's being launched against our neighbors. It's being used to sweep them up and deport them, regardless of whether they're actually subject to deportation. We don't have the luxury to be gatekeepers in our communities anymore. But the good news is lots of people aren't. They're building tools and guides and things that help welcome people in. But cheering on the newbies and supporting the oldies in this is a part of it as well. Contribute if you are technical. There's plenty of privacy-friendly open source projects that could use your help. Advocate for these things, whether they're in your workplace or in public or with otherwise. Some of the best privacy protections that we have been able to get at the Electronic Frontier Foundation happened because there were people inside the companies who pushed hard for things like your Apple device encrypting when you turn it off so that when you lose your device, you don't lose your entire life. That was a group of people inside Apple pushing for that because it was more expensive to do it that way. Now, of course, it's standard and we all take it for granted, but it was not at the beginning. And while we were pushing from the outside and beating on them, I will say that the major mover in that were people inside the company pushing for privacy. So wherever you sit, you might have power. And then, of course, innovate, trying to help. Right now, a lot of the tools we use to try to make social change, are effectively counter-moved by people in power right now. It really is time for us to get innovative and think about new ways to draw attention to the problems in our society and new ways to bring people in and new ways to help to push to make change. So those are all just ideas. At the end, my position is that the good guys throw better parties. And that it's more fun to get to wake up every day and think that you're trying to make the world better, and that can get you a very long way. So that's my formal presentation, formal-ish. I'm not a very formal person, but I'd love to. I tried to leave enough time so we can have a lot of questions. I think there's microphones that are going around. There's also some questions I think that have been submitted by students. Am I right about that? Great.
All right, audience questions. Be involved. I believe that was one of your calls to action.
Thank you. All right, so clearly the Bernstein case has made it a lot better for us in terms of users of the internet in general. But since you've won that case, how has that affected future cases, and how has that affected people's mindset in your community surrounding privacy online in general?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, I think what encryption itself has done is both visible and not visible. So in addition to, Signal and WhatsApp and the phones and stuff that are more secure, there's also a bunch of stuff under the radar, some of which was spearheaded by Alex and the crew at Michigan, which is a kind of certificate authority kind of thing that basically makes sure that when you think you're typing in the URL of your bank, you're actually going there and that somebody isn't hijacking it, which again is a kind of security that we all just live in that we don't know about, but it wasn't possible. So I think there's a bunch of technical things that are possible. I didn't get too deep in the law because I only had a couple of lawyer hands, but the case, we won the case based on the argument that computer code was speech under the First Amendment, and that the government's licensing scheme, where you have to go ask for permission before you can publish computer code, was a violation of something called the prior restraint doctrine, which is what it says it means. You can't restrain speech prior to when it happens. If you want to do that, you have to meet very, very high standards. So the fact that we were able to get code into the category of speech, and then we won on the prior restraint doctrine, has meant that I think that the bar for regulating code is a little higher than it would otherwise be, which means that Congress has to be a lot more careful about making sure that it's targeting what it's doing very specifically to the problem it's trying to solve. And I think that we set up the future regulatory world for code in a way that helps make sure that the science can continue, that open source can continue, which is a kind of code development that depends a lot on people communicating with each other across public networks. But I think even inside organizations that are trying to develop stuff, the Bernstein kind of foundation is pretty solid and set things up pretty well. Again, it doesn't mean you can't ever regulate speech. I run into people sometimes, especially who aren't like as steeped in the First Amendment as people who do it all the time, like I are, who think that like the First Amendment is like some kind of a cheat code where you can turn off everything. And it really doesn't work that way, but it does put the government to a higher standard if it wants to regulate code. And I think that's one of the other legacies of the case.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. You mentioned something that I thought was really cool, which was innovating in ways of making change. I wonder if any particular examples come to you, like especially inspiring examples of new ways of innovating and making change?
I mean, I think we're starting to see it around the world, right? I think the Hong Kong protests did a lot of interesting things to try to block surveillance of protesters, and recognizing that as one of the things that was going on, but also, people wearing the masks and stuff like that, which, again, I think of the Hong Kong protests. They probably weren't the first ones, but they were the ones who really popularized some of this. I've been watching some of the people who are doing singing, and this is outside of surveillance, but so I think there are people who are starting to try to innovate in ways to make, I actually think if you think about it, the people in Portland, wearing the crazy costumes so that the story of the protest couldn't be manipulated by the ICE agents as these guys are violent or they were attacking us, which had started to happen, right, in places like LA and other places. And, when you're in a green frog suit, like it just, and everybody's videotaping, videotaping, God, listen to me, old school, but filming you, that has really made a change in the narrative. So those are two things that I think of as kind of starting to change the narrative. I think we're just at the beginning of this, but I did, have a conversation with some people where I'm like, well, here's the book of activism. Here, like, this is the old book of activism. Like, we need to turn the page. We need new things, and I think they're not going to come from people. I think they're going to come from the next generation. We're still using techniques, and I'm not saying we should stop using them, but we're using techniques that were pioneered largely in the racial justice fights of the 50s and 60s. And again, the people who don't like social change and don't like people's rights have had a long time to figure out how to counter those moves. So we need to start thinking about new ways. And the good news is the technology gives us some opportunities to do that. The bad news is the opportunity, the technology also helps double down on surveillance and tracking as well. My colleague Cooper Quinton wrote a piece on the EFF blog a little while ago that is kind of a listing of some of the ways hackers are pushing back against ICE, things like the ICE Block app, which EFF is actually representing, and other apps that are helping people track where these raids are happening, and inform their neighbors and protect their neighbors. There's a bunch of people doing that kind of work, and I think it's critical. It's saving lives.
Hi, Aunt Cindy.
Yes, young man.
I had one quick question about the role of private companies in targeting privacy, because from an outsider perspective, it almost feels like it has changed in your 30-year career. Whereas you talked about at the beginning, companies like AT&T in the past were sort of working with the government. The government approaches them, asks to use their technology. But it almost feels like in really the past 5 to 10 years, the relationship of Silicon Valley, especially top-down, has changed where they're no longer doing this libertarian against government approach, or at least the ideological leaders, but have kind of decided that it's easier to cozy up to the government and attack privacy in that way. So I'm curious, what's your perspective in how private companies have kind of become new or different culprits in the fight on privacy, and where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I mean, for context, I think it's the shift of the tech oligarchs towards cozying up to the Trump administration is real. And I'll hit that in a moment. But I think it's important to remember Silicon Valley as a defense contractor, as a building tools for government to do surveillance is old. And indeed, kind of the lifeblood that people don't like to talk about sometimes, or at least now they talk about it a lot. But for a while, it was like the dirty underbelly of Silicon Valley, was the amount that they were building weapons and other tools for war and government. I think that but you're right that having like a social media network cozy up to the government is quite different. And I think that. I don't know. God, go figure. You gotta sit with their psychologists to try to figure out some of this. But I do think that the result of that is there was a time when we could trust that the technologies that we used were going to be neutral. They weren't going to take the side of the government. We did a whole process called Who's Got Your Back at EFF, where we were rating the big tech companies on, did they give you notice if law enforcement showed up? Did they fight back if they got an overbroad subpoena or warrant or things like that? And the companies were, AT&T was never good at this, or Verizon, but the kind of more internet companies were racing to the top to try to get, and we gave them gold stars. It was crazy. I'd have these like general counsels of giant corporations making, way more zeros at the end of their paycheck than me, kind of whining at me that they deserved a gold star, and it was great fun. But yeah, there was kind of a race to the top, and I think, and again, I think what they wanted to be was neutral and fair, and they recognized that sometimes they were all that stood between unfairness and their users, and so they would not all the time, but they would stand up for their users in ways that, or at least let the users know, so that I could show up in court, in these John Doe cases, right? We found out about these efforts to try to unmask people because the companies would tell the website owners that somebody had come and asked for their name, and then they could come to us, and then we would do the cases. So I think that this shift is very worrisome. I think it points to one of the dangers of kind of a whole other thread of technology, which is the rise of the tech giants, right? In the early 1990s, in the 2000s, when I was really getting on this, the leading technology would change periodically, right? And so there was always another company that could come and offer you something better or different, like in search, right? Or, before, Google kind of won, right? And now there aren't any other search engines. But when, before there was Alta Vista, there was Yahoo, there was Ask Jeeves, there was all sorts of things. And now there really isn't anymore. Now we'll see, right, with AI, but that's still only a couple of companies. So we may, meet the new boss the same as the old boss kind of situations with AI if we're not careful. And I think what that meant is they captured the market. They didn't face any competition, so they're looking for new money. And new money comes out of the defense industry. It comes out of cozying up to government. And so I think that a lot of what's going on with the cozying up is actually, some of it may be ideological and some of them are, a little crazy. But I think a lot of it is actually a calculation. Now that you've divided up the world into little segments and there's only 5 or 6 of you, you still have to meet your quarterly income. So you're looking for new money, and that new money is coming out of the military and governmental surveillance world. That's I am absolutely not qualified to give this analysis, but that's what it looks like from where I sit. So what do we do about it? I want to do the last thing, actually, because you did ask me I think we really do need to support efforts to try to re-decentralize the internet, to create competition again. Lina Khan tried to do some of that at the FTC. Now she's still doing some of it for Mandami in New York, but what they call the New Brandeis School. I don't agree with them about everything, but I think they're right about this, that we need to actually think about all the different ways we can create competition. And one of them is like the regulatory way, the kind of FTC and things like that. But the other way is let's build this stuff, right? Like the thing that the policy wonks don't understand is that the internet wasn't made to be 5 companies. It has a pathway for decentralization if we work hard and we take it and we build better options. And a lot of people are working on this right now. That's the promise of Blue Sky, right? It's got a different protocol called AT protocol. That's for those of you who are really deep geeks, Mastodon and those protocols. And right now they're too small and they're corners of the thing. And the AT protocol needs to be used for a lot more than just Blue Sky, but it can be. It was built like that. So re-decentralizing the internet is something that can really help make it so that we're not all dependent on the goodwill of a couple of tech oligarchs. I'll let somebody else ask a question, but people have been asking me on this tour what I think about the fight between, oh my God, my brain, Anthropic and the Department of Defense, right? Because Anthropic drew 2 red lines around what it would do for the government. One of them was autonomous weapons, which honestly, they just said we're not ready for that yet. They didn't actually say we will never do that. And the other one is domestic spying on Americans. And so it's not that surprising to me that people who are thinking about this technology and how dangerous it might be would come. Believe me, they didn't put the red lines where I would put them. I would, actually support human rights and things like that. But that this was one of the red lines was, I think, really telling about how the tech giants understand how important privacy is. But also that we shouldn't have to depend on the goodwill of one tech giant founder in order to have our privacy protected. Like there's a branch of government that should be doing that for us. Maybe 2, and maybe even in my happier days, 3.
So we have a question from our live stream audience, and in the context of the government seeing the value of privacy. What do you think government agencies or entities should have, do you think government agencies and entities should have the same rights to privacy that we want as citizens. The questioner is specifically referring to ICE and their tactics employed to find and arrest people.
Yeah, absolutely not. They work for us. I mean, that's just crazy. I hear this a lot. Like, well, if you can know this about, why can't we know this about? Why can't? It's not equal, and it should not be equal. We should have privacy, and the government should have very tiny places where they have privacy. Like I'm not saying the classification system should go away entirely, but it's way too big. Everybody who's looked at it it's metastasized into everything the government thinks might be embarrassing gets classified. Same with the ICE agents and the covering of their things and the covering of their things. I think that is misunderstanding the power dynamic to begin with. They already have a lot of power over us. They're the ones with the guns, for God's sakes. That then they should have some kind of privacy, I just think is wrong. And we have public trials, right? You have the right to confront your accusers. That's like in the Constitution. Why? Because the idea, and that judges don't show up with, this is all stuff that happens in other countries under authoritarian rule. It's not new. They didn't make that up, right? That's why they're, the black squads and things like that, right? So I absolutely think it's a completely false and silly, honestly, equivalence because of the other power dynamics that are already at play. The least we can do is know who these people are.
Hi, thanks for your talk. It was really great. So one thing that's been on my mind is the OS level age verification laws
Oh, friend, yes.
that have been coming around like all around the States and like other countries. It has me really worried. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on them, how to fight back against them, and maybe possibly what we should do to keep children safe online.
Yeah. So for those of you who aren't as deep in the weeds on this stuff as I am, there have been laws. There's a lot of concern about children online. It's pretty legit. But it's been shunted into this idea that if we make everybody show their ages, that somehow we'll protect kids. And I have very deep skepticism that showing your identification is actually going to make kids safer or keep kids off the internet. The ways around it. Australia's already doing this for social media, and the last survey I saw is that it actually did not reduce the number of kids on social media at all. It just made them sneakier. But one of the things that, I'm trying to get too deep in the weeds on this, but one of the fights was, should every app have to identify it, or should it happen at the operating system level? And in Colorado and California, and Brazil, they have passed laws that assume that there are only two operating systems in the world, Apple and Google. And so they say, well, it makes a lot more sense to do this at the operating system level than at the app level. This is why people will say, Facebook is funding a lot of this. This is why Facebook is funding it. They're trying to get Apple to do it. They have other reasons as well. I'm not going to say it's the only reason, but this is why you'll see some press online about how Facebook is funding all of this. And this is because of this kind of internal fight about where this has to happen. And so they passed these laws that said, well, every operating system has to have hooks that allow age verification, and you can't publish one that doesn't. This is very problematic. Not only is there not only two operating systems in the world, there are open source ones, right? Where by definition, by license, you have to be able to change the thing. And so it's going to make it really, really hard, if not impossible, to develop open source systems. People are working on some workarounds. But so this was bad. It got stuck in the California law at the last minute. And so while we were opposed to the law overall, we don't like age verification. We weren't really able to marshal the open source arguments until the damn thing was signed. We are marshaling them now. We are beginning to look into litigation prospects. We're a little too far out for me to say for sure. My team's got to run the traps on it, but we are looking at it. But also, anybody who's in open source, you got to make your voice heard I know for many people in open source, talking to anyone is hard, but I love my community, but I know that you are introverts at a large level, many of you. But you really do have to, because I don't think the people who, well, a couple people in the California legislature knew what they were doing, but many people didn't. They wouldn't have gotten a majority vote for let's outlaw open source if that was the thing, right? And so making sure it doesn't pass in other places, making sure it doesn't pass decisively will not only help in where you are, it'll help the larger campaign in other places, and it'll help us when we show up in court to be able to say, you know, California did this early, but later states realized what a bad idea this was. That will help us in the policy fights and in the legal fights if we can stop this cold. But right now it's not looking good, and it goes into effect in January, so we've got a little time. We can't sue a law that doesn't exist yet, but it's something that the community of hackers really, open source people really need to start making their voice heard, because it's bad and it's dangerous, and it kind of got sprung on us a bit.
That is what we have time for question-wise. I just want to remind folks that we have a reception. You'll be able to talk to Cindy, get your book. She'll be signing. So let's give a round of applause and thank you for Cindy Cohn.
Thank you. Oh, and I didn't say this. Thank you to Saul and the people at Michigan. I just jumped right in. I mean, really, they made this so easy and so fun for me to be here. I love coming back to Ann Arbor, and Saul is always game to do like crazy things for me, and Svetla as well. Thank you all so much. The Michigan has a really incredible privacy community, and I'm sorry, I just jumped right in without thanking you. Thank you so much.